Ukraine is still fighting for its survival, but what if it could get the ultimate protection without even joining NATO? 3 years into the war, Italy has just proposed a game-changing plan that could extend NATO's Article 5 protection to Ukraine without full membership. If enacted, this would rewrite the rules of military alliances and force Russia into an impossible corner. The timing couldn't be more critical. Ukraine's relationship with the US is rapidly deteriorating after a failed meeting between Trump and Zelensky. Meanwhile, NATO itself is divided, and some European countries are secretly exploring their own peacekeeping operations in Ukraine. So what's in Italy's shocking new proposal? Could it force NATO's hand, or even push Europe closer to war? And why is the US suddenly turning against Ukraine when it needs help the most? Let's break it all down. First, let's start with the exact details of Prime Minister Meloni's proposal made on March 6th. According to a report from the news outlet Ukrainska Pravda, following a press meeting in Brussels, one of the most up-to-date sources of daily proceedings in the war in Ukraine, Meloni suggested that Ukraine could gain the benefit of the collective defense principle that's at the heart of the NATO alliance and ratified by its Article 5 without actually being in the alliance itself. Meloni went on to further state, "I think that will be a stable, lasting, effective security guarantee, more than some of the proposals I'm seeing." This specifically refers to the various peacekeeping or ceasefire proposals that have circulated in meetings in the past few weeks, especially after the US made a 180-degree turn away from NATO's prevailing ideology and moved closer to Russia's position. The proposal could even go as far as to suggest NATO might extend Article 5 protection to practically any territory in the world, regardless of whether it's a NATO member or not. More realistically, however, it's fairly obvious that the proposal for extension to include Ukraine is a patchwork solution for a complicated problem that doesn't have an easy fix. As might be expected, the plan has already been met with a mixed response online, with no official support from world leaders or politicians. But this shouldn't be construed as either good or bad news for the proposal's implementation. Rather, it's probably more accurate to suggest that the plan's rather unorthodox approach to alliances and defensive agreements is so unique that it might take time before it can be properly analyzed for potential results. Well, with that in mind, what exactly is Ukraine's relationship to NATO, and why is this proposal so contentious in the first place? Ukraine's history with NATO practically began when the country gained its independence in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Since gaining its independence, Ukraine has basically yo-yoed between having a government that's pro-Russian or pro-Western. In the 1990s, Ukraine cooperated with NATO but remained neutral, seeking good relations with both the West and Russia. In 1994, Ukraine, alongside Russia, the US and the UK, signed the Budapest Memorandum, which saw Ukraine returning its stockpiles of nuclear weapons inherited from the Soviet Union to Russia in return for security and assurance against aggressive actions from the country or threats to its territorial sovereignty. In 1997, it signed a special partnership agreement with NATO, dubbed the Charter on a Distinctive Partnership, recognizing cooperation but stopping short of membership. However, a sudden shift in stances occurred during the 2004 Orange Revolution, which saw the former pro-Western Ukrainian president Viktor Yushchenko rise to power. Yushchenko pushed for Ukraine to develop deeper ties with the West, which resulted in more support for Ukraine to become part of the European Union. The Union would also allow it to share in some of the Union's economic benefits. Still, support for the country's NATO membership remained low due to the ongoing Russian influence in the country, which sowed internal divisions. In 2010, Yushchenko was succeeded by Viktor Yanukovych, who reversed many of the pro-European policies enacted between 2004 and 2010. Technically speaking, Yanukovych declared Ukraine a non-aligned state and curtailed any possibilities of the country achieving NATO ascension. In fact, Yanukovych leaned so heavily towards Russia that he rejected a possible EU deal in 2013. This brought on significant backlash, which led to the 2013-14 Euromaidan movement, which ousted Yanukovych from the government and changed the regime to a pro-Western one again. But the new government didn't have time to enact meaningful policies, specifically the ones that would move the country closer to NATO, as 2014 was the same year that Russia invaded and annexed Crimea and sparked a conflict in the region that has smoldered ever since. In truth, the annexation of Crimea could be easily construed as an attempt by the Russian government to undermine Ukraine's territorial sovereignty and geopolitical leanings, which we'll discuss shortly. Despite the Crimean conflict, or perhaps because of it, the Ukrainian government began accelerating its efforts to join NATO, making it an official strategic objective to be achieved by 2017. In fact, they went so far as to put it into the country's constitution in 2019. Ukraine's efforts to join NATO gained further momentum as it implemented reforms to align its military and government with NATO standards, including tackling corruption, improving defense capabilities, and strengthening democratic institutions. However, NATO remained cautious about offering full membership, fearing it would provoke Russia and escalate tensions, which turned out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. For Russia, Ukraine's potential NATO membership has drawn near to one of its infamous and frequently fluctuating red lines. Moscow views NATO expansion as a threat to its influence and security, particularly in former Soviet territories. Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly opposed NATO's presence near Russia's borders, and Ukraine's alignment with the West was seen as unacceptable. Ukraine was a particular target of this vitriol due to the cultures and values they share with Russia, at least until the 2010s, unlike some former Soviet nations like the Baltic states. Russia's opposition to NATO expansion would end up playing a key role in its decision to invade Ukraine in February 2022, at least on the surface. The Kremlin justified the full-scale invasion by claiming they were protecting Russian supporters in Ukraine and preventing NATO's expansion, though at that point NATO had not officially offered membership. This tug-of-war between Russia and Ukraine concerning the latter's possible NATO membership and even its mere application for membership follows a clear pattern that Russia has perpetuated for well over a decade. Whenever Ukraine starts shedding off pro-Russian influences, Russia reacts aggressively while painting the move as defensive posturing that threatens its own internal geopolitical interests. We mentioned that the current invasion of Ukraine was done in part to prevent Ukraine's ascension to NATO. This is true, to the extent that Russia holding pieces of Ukrainian territory makes the latter technically have territorial disputes in active conflict with at least one other nation. This is important because NATO has historically been hesitant to admit countries that have current territorial disputes. In theory, this is not a hard rule. The NATO ascension process follows an open-door policy where European countries can submit their intent for an application, after which the alliance will typically develop a specific membership action plan, or MAP, curated to that country's development compared to the general standard of other members. However, more strictly speaking, all members of the alliance must sign the Washington Treaty, which contains the 14 founding articles of the alliance, including the famous Article 5, which we'll get to in a bit. Among those is Article 8, which states that each party declares that none of the international engagements now in force between it and any other parties or any third state is in conflict with the provisions of this treaty, and undertakes not to enter into any international engagement in conflict with this treaty. From a literal standpoint, Ukraine's ongoing war with Russia could violate the founding NATO articles. In a similar vein, NATO is also hesitant to accept a country in an open conflict because it might automatically trigger the aforementioned Article 5, essentially plunging most of Europe into war. But let's discuss the pivotal Article 5 for a bit. While the entire article is quite lengthy, the important part for our purposes is the following. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. This stipulates that all parties are practically bound to defend a fellow nation against any other member's aggressor. In essence, Article 5 represents a level of protection against both conventional and nuclear attacks that is unprecedented in the modern world. It is exactly the reason that NATO has been so effective in maintaining and growing its influence over the past 3 decades. Somewhat ironically, these guarantees are only effective during peacetime. Article 5, in theory and likely in practice, only protects a country that currently isn't in an open conflict from being plunged into one. The presence of a concerted defense that includes a considerable number of the alliance's members who are among the top 10 economies and top 20 militaries in the world, with the US taking both first spots specifically, means that Article 5 will hopefully prevent a non-member nation from making any aggressive move. There are no practical applications for Article 5 being used to stop an active aggressor from initiating or escalating an ongoing conflict. The latter is why NATO has been hesitant to discuss Ukraine's possible inclusion in the organization during the course of the war. At some point, Ukraine even suggested that it cede the portion of territory Russia currently controls in exchange for an Article 5 guarantee on the rest of the country and their eventual ascension to NATO. Ukraine's objective in proposing this version of the ceasefire or peace agreement, depending on how it will be enforced, was to try to gain back the lost territory via diplomatic channels, hopefully by having NATO draw up some concessions to Russia that would pacify its aggressive posturing toward former Soviet countries in Europe or its other NATO neighbors like Finland. So where does that leave the current proposal by the Italian Prime Minister to apply NATO's Article 5 to Ukraine without giving them full membership? Well, it's a bit of a circular argument when Article 5 is used as a deterrent, rather than a way to end an existing war. If by some chance the entire NATO agrees to this move, it would only be feasible if Ukraine and Russia agree to a temporary ceasefire, which is currently being brokered separately by the US, various European NATO members, and possibly even China. In that case, the ceasefire, in whatever shape and form it takes, could then be followed by NATO extending the so-called Article 5 guarantee over Ukraine's free territory. This would essentially force Russia to end its offensive and initiate a redraw of the border between the two countries. It would also need to ambiguously place the occupied territory within either country's borders, depending on whether Russia can forcefully annex them as it did with Crimea more than a decade ago. Of course, regardless of the actual practicality of the proposal in question, it's likely going to run into significant opposition from the alliance's most influential member, the US. The proposal would merely put the conflict on ice until Ukraine and Russia conclude more diplomatically rather than through warfare, which is unlikely. While the current American foreign policy, guided by President Trump, is focusing more on ending the war as soon as possible. Trump's most recent proposal could work directly counter to the SHIELD expansion one, as the former precludes Ukraine from ever becoming a NATO member and also yields to Russia the territory it took over the past 3 years. Even worse for Ukraine, Trump's proposals hinge on Ukraine also surrendering a large portion of its mineral resources to the US, although it's not quite clear just how connected the two pieces of the deal are. Regardless, the most recent iteration of the ceasefire or peace proposals offered by the US put Ukraine at a significant disadvantage, as they don't give it any practical guarantees against Russia repeating the invasion at a later date to finish the job, so to speak. Instead, it puts Ukraine into a sort of limbo where it doesn't have NATO protection, is forbidden from ever joining it, and parts of its territory have been stripped away and given to Russia in what Trump calls a fair conquest. To counter the US proposal, the European part of the NATO Council has brought forth the possibility of stationing peacekeepers from across Europe in Ukraine, but even that is undecided. This stems from the significant inter-NATO disputes involving members who have historically sided more with Russia, such as Turkey, Hungary, and Slovakia. Turkey, for example, vetoed Sweden's ascension to the alliance for over a year, citing its alleged harboring of terrorist groups. However, tensions also stemmed from Sweden's criticism of Turkey's human rights record and democratic standards, which angered politicians in Ankara. Whatever the actual cause, it was pretty clear that this ended up directly or indirectly benefiting Russia's goal of delaying NATO's expansion for as long as possible. Given that Russia was already invading Ukraine when Sweden and Finland joined the alliance, it's likely that Russia saw the moves as yet another attempt to reduce Russia's influence strictly to its own borders rather than outward toward the former Soviet Union or the entire Warsaw Pact. The same response from seemingly pro-Russian NATO members could continue if the Council attempts to create a peacekeeping force to maintain a potential ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. A few vetoes would grind the initiative to a halt. This possibility led to the UK and France specifically trying to cooperate with a few select European nations to create a more limited peacekeeping force that would work under limited NATO guidelines. France and the UK have referred to the smaller group as the Coalition of the Willing, mirroring a similar coalition involving Poland, the UK, and a few other countries during the US invasion of Iraq. Ironically, that US invasion is also the only actual example of Article 5 being evoked in practice, which means that it was arguably the US who stood to gain the most by leveraging it and forcing European nations to mobilize their troops abroad. In fact, Ukraine itself participated in the war in Iraq, sending a little over 6,100 soldiers in total over the course of 5 years in what was the country's biggest military deployment before the war in Ukraine. This was despite Ukraine not being in NATO itself. However, by that point, Ukraine had signed an agreement with NATO and was part of the United Nations Monitoring, Verification, and Inspection Commission. Also worth noting, the new Coalition of the Willing doesn't seem to include Italy, as its Prime Minister had previously stated that Italy has strict limits on the use and deployment of its troops abroad. This means it's unlikely that Italy would independently send its troops to serve as peacekeepers in Ukraine without the rest of NATO providing the same guarantee and deploying their own forces to the cause. This somewhat paradoxical approach underlines Italy's current foreign policy. Meloni was elected as Prime Minister after serving as the leader of a far-right political party in the country. In theory, they align well with Trump's ongoing policies, and yet Trump has managed to defy expectations by going a step further and completely bypassing NATO and unabashedly favoring Russia by attempting to create a unilateral peace agreement brokered by the US and Russia only, and would be signed by Ukraine when it was done. Meloni, on the other hand, has reserved a much more positive view of Ukraine throughout both the war and the more recent negotiations. This is reflected in the more comprehensive guarantee that the Italian proposal would provide compared to the various Trump deal attempts or the Coalition of the Willing movements. Ukraine has stated that it's cautiously interested in Meloni's proposal, as it underscores a more complete security guarantee than any other option on the table that doesn't include full NATO membership. The country's foreign ministry had stated that they would like to know more about it before accepting. There are two major factors working against Ukraine. First, Zelensky is rapidly running out of negotiation bargaining chips. While it's clear that the European part of NATO supports Ukraine trying to get out of the war with its entire territory intact, the US has tried more aggressive tactics to end the conflict quicker, which includes imposing significant economic damage to both parties involved in the war if a deal cannot be reached. That the proposal needs to be unanimous pretty much makes it unlikely that it will be approved due to its perceived anti-US agenda. Secondly, Ukraine is also running out of manpower and equipment to use in the war. The country's conscription efforts have been steadily increasing over the past 3 years. However, despite that, Russia maintains a clear numbers advantage in the total active manpower, owing to the fact that it contains more than 3 times Ukraine's overall population. By some estimates, Ukraine might have enough people to man the front lines for another 6 months before it starts experiencing permanent manpower deficits. Both Russia and the US know this, hence Trump's attempts to end the war as quickly as possible. While a peace deal forged quickly would technically save more lives, the US can afford to be more aggressive with its terms, knowing that Ukraine is on thin ice if the rest of NATO doesn't reach a consensus about peacekeeping forces and enforcing security guarantees on Ukrainian soil. Regardless of the stance NATO members will take toward the Italian proposal, one thing is clear: all sides of the conflict have long roads ahead of them diplomatically. Ukraine may be forced to shape its peace proposals in a way that seemingly favors Russia, or at least halt any talks of Ukraine joining NATO, in an attempt to cow Russia into accepting the most favorable deal for Ukraine, while still allowing Russia to feel as if they've won. But what do you think? Does the Italian idea have merit? And could this lead to Europe getting plunged into war? Thanks for watching, and leave a comment below. Now go and check out Ukraine Can't Believe What Finland Just Did. Insane support. Or click this other video instead.